This is LSAT PrepTest 151, Section 1, Passage 3. This is a comparative passage about opera. The question is whether music and words belong together or apart. This is a low difficulty passage. The disagreement's pretty straightforward, but there is a sneaky area of agreement that could trip you up on the questions. Now, the most important moment in this passage pair is the second half of Passage B. This is where the author commits to a position that directly contradicts Passage A. And so if you read Passage B as being just a history of opera types, you're going to miss the argument entirely. Now, Passage A gets to the point pretty fast. Music doesn't need words. In fact, words drag it down. The author's logic goes like this. Words can trigger emotions, but they can't fully express them. Music can. And so when you attach words to music, you're weakening the stronger art form. You get a flashy result, but you lose purity. The phrase greater alone is doing all the work here. That is the thesis in 2 words. Now, you don't want to read too fast through the middle of Passage A. There is a concession hiding in there. The author admits various good ends can come from combining music and words, but only if the words stay subordinate to the music. And that is a real qualifying statement. It means the author isn't saying the combination's always terrible. They're saying music should always be in charge, and ideally, it wouldn't need the help at all. If you compress this into just saying, Passage A says music and words should never mix, you have overshot, and the questions will punish you for it. Now, the example of Beethoven's Fifth and the opera comments at the end are just reinforcement. The author is piling on, not adding any new ideas. You want to move through this part quickly. You already have the author's position. Now, Passage B starts with what looks like a classification system. There are 3 types of opera: music dominant, balanced, and music subordinate. You don't want to get bogged down memorizing these categories. They're just set up. The author mentions the 3rd type, where music takes a back seat, did not survive. It couldn't hold an audience. And that detail matters more than it might seem. If the author is quietly agreeing that music has to be central, that's pretty important. You want to file that away. Now, the real argument here kicks in around the middle of Passage B. This is where you've got to slow down. The author makes a claim that sounds simple, but actually is pretty deep. They're saying you cannot judge the music or the poetry of an opera by itself. The music isn't good because it would work well in a concert hall, and the poetry isn't good because it reads well on a page. Each piece is only good if it serves the opera as a whole. And that is a fundamentally different way of thinking about art than what Passage A is proposing. Passage A wants to pull the elements apart and rank them. Passage B says pulling them apart destroys the thing you're trying to evaluate. And then you get the analogy at the very end. Music and poetry in opera are like hydrogen and oxygen in water. That's important. That's the author's strongest version of their argument. Of course, you could analyze the parts separately if you want, but in practice, they are combined, they're fused together. You can't have water without both. And so here is the disagreement, and you've got to get this precise. It's not about whether music matters. Both authors agree music is the most important element. Passage A says it outright. Passage B calls it the most important too. And that overlap is bait. You're going to see choices that frame their disagreement as being about the importance of music, and those are wrong. The actual disagreement here is about separation. Passage A says music is strongest on its own, it can stand alone, and it should. Words are a compromise at best. Passage B says the whole point of opera is fusion, and judging any element in isolation misses what opera actually is. Now, here is another trap you want to watch for. Passage A does talk about opera. The author even concedes that opera's value comes from its emotional range. So you might see an answer that says both authors value opera's emotional power. And that could be tempting, but Passage A's author is really saying the emotional power comes from the music, despite the words, not because of the combination. So that agreement is only surface level. Underneath, they're pointing in opposite directions. Now, before you go on to the questions, you want to check yourself on 3 things. First, what is the one condition under which Passage A's author accepts combining music and words? Second, why does Passage B bring up that failed 3rd type of opera? It's not random, it's doing structural work. And third, if the author of Passage A read that hydrogen and oxygen analogy, what would they say is wrong with it? So that was passage 3. And by the way, folks, the recordings of all these lives are on the LSAT Unplugged YouTube channel, linked in my bio. I'll also be doing my regular daily live Q&A at 2 p.m. Eastern, 1 Central, 11 Pacific, about 3 hours from now. Next, we've got passage 4. So this is LSAT PrepTest 151, section 1, passage 4, about plate tectonics. Why some subduction zones produce earthquakes and others don't. Difficulty is fairly low. If you understand one chain of reasoning, you're going to be fine on this one. Now, this is a gap filler passage, meaning the old theory has a hole, a group of scientists patches it, and that's the whole thing. The main point here is that standard plate tectonics can't explain why some zones with tons of subduction stay quiet. These scientists say it comes down to how the plates are moving relative to each other. Now, paragraph 1 you could read pretty quickly. It is the textbook version. Plates move, they collide, one slides under the other, pressure builds, earthquake. You've heard this before. And the passage assumes you've heard it before too. So you don't want to get bogged down memorizing the setup. But you don't want to drift off at the end of the paragraph either, because the last couple sentences are the whole reason the passage exists. The theory says intense subduction should mean earthquakes, except some zones with intense subduction are basically silent, and that contradiction is the fuel for everything that follows. If you skim past it, you're going to spend paragraphs 2 and 3 wondering what problem's actually being solved. Now, paragraph 2 is where you get your points. You want to slow way down here. The scientists draw a line between two kinds of collisions. The first kind is that the plates move toward each other, head on. In those collisions, the subduction zone basically stays put relative to the mantle below. The plate that gets pushed under slides down at a shallow angle. Think of it like you're sliding a card under a book on a table. There is lots of surface contact, lots of friction. That is your earthquake zone. The second kind is where you have both plates moving in the same direction, just one's faster. So it catches up and its front edge slides under the slower plate. Now the collision zone is traveling along with the plates. And because it's moving, the overtaking plate runs into serious resistance from the mantle underneath. And that resistance shoves it down steep, almost vertical. And steep means there is very little contact between the two plates. Little contact, little friction means few earthquakes. So here is what you gotta lock in. There is a 3-step chain. The direction the plates move determines the angle of descent. The angle determines how much surface contact there is. The contact determines how much friction you get. That is the whole explanation. And so if a question asks why quiet zones are quiet, you've got to have 3 steps, all of them. You don't want to jump straight to saying less friction. You've got to know why there is less friction. Now, the sandpaper comparison near the end of paragraph 2 is just making the head-on case more live and real. Imagine you've got 2 sheets of sandpaper pressed together, flat, maximum resistance. That is the shallow angle collision. It's a good image, but you don't want to overthink it. It's not adding any new idea. It's restating the one you already have. Then paragraph 3 is short, only a couple sentences, but you don't want to skip that one either because it flips the implication. The proposal doesn't just explain why some dangerous-looking zones are safe. It says some safe-looking zones might actually be dangerous. The passage uses the word innocuous, which just means harmless. And the old thinking here was simple. Low subduction, low risk. But this proposal says that's not enough information. You've also got to know the type of collision. A low subduction zone where plates move toward each other could still produce a serious earthquake. And that reversal is a gift to the people writing the questions here, expected to show up. Now the question is, what is the author's stance? What's their opinion? What's their tone? There is no skepticism anywhere in this passage. They're not saying some critics argue or it remains to be seen. The author presents this proposal like it works. They treat it like a real answer to a real gap. The trap is picking a choice that says the author is cautious or undecided, but they're not. They're bought in on this. Now here is the other common mistake. Students sometimes walk away thinking this passage is about plate tectonics in general, but it's not. It's about one specific question. Why do some subduction zones not produce earthquakes? And every paragraph serves to answer that question. If a choice pulls you toward a broader claim about how plate tectonics works overall, that is too broad. Now, before you go to the questions, you want to check yourself on 3 things. First, can you explain the difference between the 2 collision types without looking back at the passage? Second, can you walk through the chain from plate direction to angle to contact to friction? And third, Do you know what the last paragraph warns about and why it follows from the proposal? So that was test 151. We're going to go on to test 150 now. So this is LSAT Prep Test 150. We're looking at section 4, passage 1. So LSAT Prep Test 150, section 4, passage 1, about Wynton Marsalis and the collapse of the jazz recording industry. Fairly easy passage to follow, but there is a trap baked into the structure that does catch a lot of students. Now, this is an arts passage. It's telling you how Marsalis championed jazz history and how the music industry took that message and ran in a direction he never intended. The main point is not that Marsalis killed jazz, it's that the industry exploited his reverence for the past to justify abandoning new artists. Now, the most important paragraph is paragraph 4. That is where the author separates Marsalis' actual position from what the record labels did with it. And if you don't catch that split, you're going to misread the whole passage. Now, paragraph 1 is pure setup. Marsalis was dominant, great player, powerful voice for jazz. But then the backlash came. Critics and musicians accused him of being too backward-looking. Notice the word neo-traditionalism. That just means he was pushing jazz to stick close to its root rather than experiment. So you get 20 years of rise and fall compressed into one paragraph. You want to read this at a pretty normal speed. It's background, but it anchors everything that follows. Then paragraph 2 is the damage report. 15 CDs in 1999, then silence. No new releases, no record contract. Columbia gutted its jazz lineup. Atlantic basically walked away from new jazz entirely. Now, every detail here is doing the same job, showing you the industry-wide retreat from jazz. You don't need to memorize the label names here, just register the scale of the impact. This was not one company making a bad call, the entire business moved at once. Now, paragraph 3 is the one creating the trap here. This is where the critics get their say. They blame Marsalis directly. They say he turned jazz into a rigid, rule-bound thing. He codified it, meaning he locked it into a fixed set of standards. And there's a former Columbia exec calling it museum-like. Now you want to stop and ask, whose opinion is this? It is the critics, not the authors. The passage is just reporting the accusation. It is not endorsing it. And if you blur that line, you're going to get some attitude questions wrong. Now, paragraph 4 is the author's actual argument, and it's got two parts. The first part defends Marsalis. He never wanted people to just copy the old masters. He used tradition as raw material and pushed it toward in his own compositions. Excuse me, let me back up a bit. Paragraph 4 is the author's actual argument, and it has two parts. The first part defends Marsalis. He never wanted people to just copy the old masters. He used tradition as raw material and pushed it forward in his own compositions. That's the author telling you the criticism in paragraph 3 is at least partly unfair. And then the word however hits. In the second half, the record executives took away a completely different lesson. They heard Marsalis say the old masters were great, and they thought, then why are we spending money on new people? So they stopped. The author is drawing a clean line. Marsalis' intent was artistic, and the industry's response was financial. These are two different things, and the passage is looking for you to see the difference here. Then paragraph 5 drives it home with a three-way split. Young musicians looked at the jazz masters and saw inspiration. Critics looked and saw blind worship. Record companies looked and saw brands they could resell cheaply. Now, the last group is the one the author cares about the most. The economics were irresistible. It costs almost nothing to slap a new cover on an old album compared to finding and developing a new artist. And that is the real force behind the decline. It's not Marsalis' philosophy, it's just money. Now, the key move here is the gap between intention and consequence. Marsalis meant one thing, the industry did another. And so they're going to make the hardest questions here around whether you can keep those two things separate. Now, the author is sympathetic to Marsalis. They're not uncritical because the author acknowledges the backlash is real, but the author's explanation for the decline points at the record labels, not at Marsalis. The main trap here is treating paragraph 3 like it's the author's own view, but it's not. It is the prosecution's case. The author spends paragraphs 4 and 5 offering a different explanation. And if you miss that, you're going to pick answers saying the author blames Marsalis for jazz's problems, and those answers would be dead wrong. Now, before you hit the questions, you want to check yourself on three things. First, what does the author think Marsalis was actually trying to do? Second, why did the record companies shift to reissues? And third, can you name whose voice is speaking in paragraph 3 versus paragraph 4? On to the next. This is LSAT PrepTest 150, Section 4, Passage 2, about philosophy of mind. They're asking the question here, do you actually know your own thoughts, or do you just think you do? This is a medium difficulty passage. The ideas are not too bad, but the passage is sneaky about where they ultimately come down. Now, this is a humanities passage tearing down a common belief. The main point here is that some psychologists argue that your feeling of knowing your own thoughts directly is an illusion. You're actually inferring them, just like you infer what other people think. Now, paragraph 1 is the most important paragraph in this passage. You don't want to skim it. It's opening with the common sense view that you know your own thoughts directly, you guess at everybody else's. Simple enough. But then they drop in a challenge almost immediately. They tell us about how experiments with young children show that kids can correctly describe what's in front of them, but misdescribe their own thoughts about it. So sit with that for a second. The kids are thinking the right things, they just can't tell you what they're thinking. And that gap there is the whole foundation of the psychologist's argument. If you could just look inward and see your thoughts, kids would get it right too. But they don't. So the psychologists conclude that knowing your own thoughts is inferential. It is a skill, not a superpower. And if it's a skill, you could be bad at it. That's why kids mess it up. So you've got to walk away from paragraph 1 knowing that everything after it is built on this one experimental finding. Then paragraph 2 exists to answer a question you should already be asking. If we're really just inferring our own thoughts, why does it feel instant and certain? Why doesn't it feel like we're guessing? And the psychologists use an expertise analogy here. For example, chess. Chess experts say they can just see whether a position is strong with no calculation. It feels like perception to them, but it's not. It's inferences that go so fast that they become invisible. Same thing with your own thoughts. You've been doing it your whole life with billions of reps, so you stopped noticing. And once you stop notice that you're inferring, it feels like you're seeing your thoughts directly. That is the illusion. Now, the chess example is just there to make one point. Expertise makes inference feel like perception. So grab that idea and then move on. Paragraph 3 is where most students get tripped up, and this one's pretty subtle. The paragraph opens with what sounds like a fatal problem for the psychologists. If we're just inferring our own thoughts, does that mean we're basically watching our own behavior from the outside? Like a stranger is guessing what we think. It sounds ridiculous, and the author knows it sounds ridiculous. They have the phrase perilously close there doing real work. It is a signal that this objection has some real teeth to it. But then the paragraph saves the psychologist's argument. They're not saying you watch your own behavior, they're saying you base your inferences on internal cognitive activity that isn't itself thought, like quick sensations and flashes of emotion. Stuff that happens inside you privately. And here's why that matters. Because it's private, no one else can access it. No one can ever contradict your self-inference from the outside, and that's why it feels infallible. You're using evidence nobody else can see, so you never get corrected, so you never doubt it. Now, the key move is that distinction in paragraph 3 between external behavior and internal cognitive activity. The whole argument rests on that middle ground. If the psychologists were stuck saying we just watch our own behavior, the theory collapses. But they're not stuck there. They carved out this category of private internal insights. They're not thoughts, but they're not external either. They're signals, and that's what makes the theory work. You could expect the hardest questions in this passage to test whether you understood that distinction. Now, the author does not explicitly pick a side, but you do want to pay attention to the structure here. The author raises the strongest objection to the psychologist's view and then walks you through how they survive it. That's not what you do when you think someone's wrong. The passage is built to make the psychologist's case look solid. If you read the author as being critical or neutral, you're going to miss the lean indicating their opinion. Now, the big trap here is mixing up the common sense view with the psychologist's view. The common sense view says you know your thoughts directly and infallibly. The psychologists say the feeling of directness is itself the illusion. Those are opposites. So every main point question, every attitude question depends on you keeping those clean. Now, before you hit the questions, you want to check yourself on these three things. First, can you explain why the children's mistakes matter for the argument? Second, can you say what the chess analogy is actually proving? And third, can you articulate why internal cognitive activity, not external behavior, is what holds the psychologist's theory together? If you're fuzzy on any of those three, you want to go back to the passage before you touch the questions. So that was passage 2. Next, passage 3. This is LSAT PrepTest 150, section 4, passage 3, about dowsing. People who walk around with sticks trying to find water underground. The question is whether dowsing is real, whether it's legit. Pretty low difficulty passage. It's got a pretty straightforward structure, but there is one thing at the end that catches people off guard. Now, this is a science passage. It sets up a debate between skeptics and believers, and then it quietly picks a side. If you miss that it picks a side, you're going to be in trouble. Now, paragraph 1 is background. It tells you what dowsing is, how the stick works, and how dowsers claim to measure depth and flow rate. There is no argument here, no opinion, just a demonstration. So you want to move quickly. The one detail worth flagging is that the tools are called inert. That is not a throwaway word. The skeptics build their entire first argument on it. If the tools are inert, then the tools aren't doing anything, which means the dowser must be doing it all subconsciously. So that logic chain starts with this one word. Then paragraph 2 is the skeptic's turn. You want to slow down here because the skeptics make 3 separate arguments and the test loves to isolate one of them and ask you about it. So argument number 1, the tools are inert. So dowsers are really just reading surface clues without knowing it. Argument 2, studies show inconsistent success rates across dowsers. Argument 3, dowsing mostly happens where groundwater is already everywhere, so hitting water isn't really that impressive. You've got to keep these 3 things separate. If a question asks what the skeptics would say about a particular scenario, you've got to know which argument applies. Now, paragraph 3 is the proponents pushing back. But notice what they do first. They don't just say dowsing works. They attack the studies. They say the study populations are bad. Most dowsers are self-proclaimed amateurs. The proven ones aren't well represented. So this is a direct shot at the skeptics' inconsistent results argument. It's saying your data is garbage because your sample is garbage. And then the proponents go further. They make 2 positive claims. One, that good dowsers might be detecting changes in the Earth's electromagnetic field. 2, that the dowsers actually outperform geologists and hydrologists using real scientific equipment. You want to hold on to those 2 claims because they're set up for what comes next. Paragraph 4 is the most important paragraph in this passage. This is where skimming is going to cost you points. It opens with the word corroborated, and that one word changes everything. Up to this point, the passage feels like a balanced debate. Skeptics say this, proponents say that, who knows? But corroborated means confirmed. The author is telling you a study backed up the proponent's last 2 claims. That is not neutral language. And the study is designed to neutralize the skeptics' arguments. The teams didn't know the areas. There were no surface clues. So you can't say the dowsers were reading the terrain. The dowsers outperformed the scientists, so you can't say scientific methods are any better. And they even found a dry fracture zone on purpose. That suggests they're actually detecting something underground, not just getting lucky in water-rich areas. So each part of this study maps onto a specific skeptic argument and then dismantles it. Now, the key move here is the paragraph 4, which is breaking the tie. The whole passage, let me get a sip of water here. The whole passage builds like a fair debate, then the author lets the evidence settle it. If you read this as saying both sides have good points, there's no conclusion, you're going to miss the main point. Now, the author's stance is cautiously pro-dowsing. Not like saying dowsing is definitely real, more like the best evidence we have supports the proponents. And the main trap here is reading paragraph 4 as just another opinion in the debate. But it's not, it is evidence. The author treats it differently than the claims in paragraphs 2 and 3. The skeptics assert things, the proponents claim things, but paragraph 4 reports results. And that difference in how the information is presented tells you where the author lands. Now, before you hit the questions, you want to check yourself on these 3 things. First, why does the passage specifically mention that the study teams had no surface clues to work with? Second, which skeptic argument does the dry fracture zone finding undermine? And third, can you state in one sentence what the author thinks, not what the skeptics think, not what the proponents think, but what the author's own position is based on how paragraph 4 is written. So that was passage 3. We're going to do passage 4. Got a comment here from Hannah. Hannah, if you're having trouble with the LSAT, sorry to hear it, you can book a free LSAT lesson with me. That's open to everybody, by the way. The link to book the free lesson with me is unpluggedprep.com/start. Link is below the video on YouTube, pinned in the chat on YouTube, in my bio on TikTok and IG as well. Open offer for everybody watching this now and later. Happy to help you out. Next passage. This is LSAT Prep Test 150, Section 4, Passage 4. This is a comparative or dual passage set. The topic is whether judges should do their own independent scientific research. Medium difficulty passage. The content's pretty straightforward. The trap is assuming the two authors disagree. Now, this is a comparative passage where the two sides look like opposites but are not. Passage A argues for independent research at trial. Passage B argues against it on appeal. Different courts, different conclusions, same underlying principle. If you miss that, you're going to get some relationship questions wrong. Now, Passage A opens with two objections that some trial judges raise against doing their own research. First, it undermines the adversarial system. Second, judges aren't good enough researchers. Now, that whole first paragraph is just setup. You don't want to slow down for that. The objections exist so the author can tear them apart. Now, paragraph 2 is where the author's actual position lives. You want to read this one carefully. The rebuttal to the first objection has real teeth to it. The author is saying the adversarial system is already failing with science. Both sides hire paid experts, so you're guaranteed to get partisan conflicting testimony. Now, here's the part students miss. The author raises the stakes. Scientific rulings don't just affect one case, they ripple into future cases. So a bad call does lasting damage. That's the justification for letting judges research on their own. The system is already broken, so independent research is the fix, not the problem. Now, paragraph 3 handles the second objection. It's short and you can move through this one pretty fast. The point is simple. The trial itself keeps the judge in check. The parties still frame the debate, and the judge's research fills gap it doesn't take over. And so passage A's position is clear. Independent research at trial is fine. It is a supplement, not a replacement. The adversarial system survives because the parties still run the show. Now, passage B. Different court, different answer. The author is talking about appellate courts, and the position is no. Appellate courts should stay out of independent research entirely. And the reason comes down to one thing. Appellate courts don't hear live witnesses. They can't cross-examine anybody. And that matters because passage B treats cross-examination as the key safeguard. The author calls it the greatest legal engine ever invented for the discovery of truth. So that's not casual language there. That tells you how central cross-examination is to this author's whole argument. And so when an appellate court pulls in a scientific article on its own, nobody can challenge it. No expert gets to say the study's outdated. No lawyer can poke any holes in it. So the testing process that makes evidence reliable only exists at trial. Then the author makes an institutional argument at the end. When appellate courts go outside the record to find new facts, they're doing the trial court's job. They're supposed to review decisions, not make new ones. The author singles out internet sources as being especially unreliable, but their criticism applies to any outside material regardless of the format. And that closes the door completely here. Now, here is the key move. The two authors are not on opposite sides. If you're reading fast, you might see it as being passage A says yes and passage B saying no, assuming it's a debate, but it's not. They agree on the principle. Evidence needs to be tested through the adversarial process. They just apply that principle to different courts and get different results. And passage B actually helps you see this. The author goes out of the way here to list what trial courts have. They've got live testimony, cross-examination, judges questioning witnesses, and those are exactly the safeguards passage A relies on to justify independent research at trial. So passage B is not attacking passage A's position, it's explaining why the same logic doesn't transfer up to the appellate level. So the relationship is one of compatibility, not conflict. Same underlying principle, different contexts, different outcomes. And the main trap is picking answers that say these authors disagree, but they don't. On relationship questions, you want to look for answers about shared premises or complementary conclusions. On questions asking what one author would say about the other's argument, you could expect agreement or qualified support, not opposition. You also want to watch for wrong answers that blur the court levels. The test loves swapping trial for appellate to see if you're paying attention. If a choice says passage A supports independent research by appellate courts, that's wrong. Passage A never goes there. Now, before you hit the questions, you want to check yourself on these three things. First, why does passage A say the adversarial system specifically fails with scientific evidence? Second, what single tool does passage A, Second, what single tool does passage B treat as the reason trial courts can handle independent research, but appellate courts can't? And third, can you state in one sentence the principle both authors share? So that's it, folks. I'll be back in about 3.5 hours or 2.5 hours for the daily live Q&A at 2 p.m. Eastern, 1 Central, 11 Pacific, here on YouTube, TikTok, IG, and so on. I'll see you all then. Talk soon.